I arrived at my lakefront just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, and froze. Where there should have been still water and quiet reeds swaying in the morning breeze, there were cabins. 12 of them. Fresh timber, stone fire pits, private docks stretching into the lake, and worst of all, bright red sold signs planted like flags along the shoreline that had belonged to my family for generations. For a moment, I couldn't move. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Like the land itself didn't recognize me anymore. This wasn't just property. This was where my father taught me to fish at sunrise. Where my grandfather built the original dock with his own hands. Every inch of that shoreline carried a memory, and now it had been carved up, claimed, and sold, without a single word to me. No notice. No permission. No warning. Just taken. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, gravel crunching under my boots, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. And that's when I remembered something. A document, buried, forgotten, hidden away for 3 long years. And suddenly, everything changed. My name is Alex Carter. I'm 42 years old. And that stretch of lakefront land isn't just where I live, it's where my life began. The moment you turn onto the narrow, tree-lined lane leading to my property, something shifts. The noise of the outside world fades, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Towering oaks arch across the path like a natural cathedral, their branches filtering the sunlight into a golden mosaic that dances across the gravel driveway. It's the kind of place that feels untouched by time, quiet, grounded, real. My home sits on 3 acres that hug the water's edge. The shoreline curves gently, lined with tall reeds that sway with every passing breeze. On calm days, the lake stretches out like glass, reflecting the sky so perfectly it feels like you're standing between 2 worlds. Mornings are usually still, just birdsong, the faint ripple of water, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. But what makes this place sacred isn't the view. It's the history. I learned how to fish right off that dock, standing beside my father as the sun rose over the water. He'd guide my hands, patient and steady, teaching me more about life in those quiet moments than words ever could. Summers were spent barefoot on the shoreline, building things with my grandfather, small repairs, wooden benches, even parts of the dock itself. He used to say, "Take care of the land, and it'll take care of you." And it did. Evenings brought a different kind of magic. Fireflies hovering just above the grass, their glow blinking like distant stars. The sound of water gently lapping against the dock, steady and calming. Nights where I'd sit alone, staring out across the lake, feeling like the rest of the world had simply disappeared. Every tree here has a story. Every stone has been stepped on by someone I loved. This isn't just land passed down through paperwork, it's a legacy carved through time, memory, and presence. And I protected it. I kept it simple. No flashy renovations. No unnecessary changes. Just quiet preservation. A place where nothing needed to be improved, because it was already complete. That's why what I saw that morning didn't just feel wrong. It felt like a violation. Because this wasn't some empty plot someone could develop or repurpose. This was a living piece of my family's history. A sanctuary built over generations, not for profit, not for appearance, but for meaning. And someone had decided they could take it, reshape it, and sell it like it was nothing. Standing there, looking out at those cabins cutting across the shoreline, I didn't just feel anger. I felt something deeper. Like someone had reached into my past and tried to erase it. From the outside, the neighborhood looked perfect. Neatly paved streets curved through rows of well-kept homes, each one painted in soft, neutral tones, beige, gray, muted white, colors carefully selected to blend with the natural environment, as the HOA handbook liked to say. Lawns were trimmed to identical lengths. Flower beds were symmetrical. Even the mailboxes matched, polished and aligned like silent sentinels of order. At first, it felt comforting. Predictable. Safe. After years of watching the world change, become louder, faster, more chaotic, there was something reassuring about a place where everything seemed controlled. No surprises. No disruptions. Just quiet consistency. That's how they sold it. But over time, I started to notice the pattern. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were expectations. And those expectations weren't always written down. It started small. A neighbor receiving a warning letter because their fence was 2 inches higher than regulation. Another being asked to repaint their house because the shade of grey wasn't approved. Someone else forced to remove a small garden sculpture because it didn't match the community aesthetic. At first, people complied without question. No one wanted to make waves. After all, the system worked, property values stayed high, the neighborhood looked pristine, and everything ran smoothly. But underneath that polished surface, there was pressure. A quiet, constant pressure. You didn't just live there, you adapted. Adjusted. Conformed. Decisions weren't really yours. They were filtered, reviewed, and either approved or denied by a small group of people sitting behind polished tables at monthly HOA meetings. And if you paid attention closely enough, you could see something else. Control wasn't evenly applied. Some violations were ignored. Others were enforced immediately. Some homeowners seemed to move freely within the rules, while others were scrutinized for the smallest details. It wasn't just about maintaining standards. It was about who held power. My property sat slightly apart from the rest, larger, older, untouched by many of the newer improvements the HOA encouraged. While others modernized, expanded, and reshaped their land to fit the evolving aesthetic, I chose to leave mine as it had always been. Natural. Quiet. Unchanged. At first, no one said anything. But I could feel it, that subtle attention. The occasional glance during meetings. The polite but pointed questions about future plans for my shoreline. Suggestions disguised as friendly advice. You know, Alex, that area could really benefit from some development. Have you ever considered upgrading your dock? Bringing it up to community standards. Comments like that, always casual, always smiling, but never accidental. It became clear that my land didn't quite fit their vision. And in a place where everything was designed to align, anything that stood apart eventually became a target. I didn't realize just how much of a target until it was too late. Because in this neighborhood, control didn't always come through force. Sometimes, it came quietly. Approved in meetings you didn't attend. Signed in documents you never saw. And enforced in ways you couldn't stop until it was already happening. If the HOA was the engine that kept the neighborhood running, then Linda Hawthorne was the one behind the wheel. She was impossible to ignore. 55, impeccably dressed, always arriving a few minutes early to every meeting, heels clicking sharply against the tile floor like a metronome of authority. Her presence alone could quiet a room. Conversations would soften, heads would turn, and before she even spoke, people were already listening. Linda had mastered something rare, the ability to appear warm while maintaining absolute control. Her smile was polished, practiced to perfection. Friendly, but never fully genuine. Her voice carried a smooth confidence, the kind that made even the strictest rules sound reasonable, even helpful. She didn't demand authority. She suggested it. And somehow, that made people follow her even more. At HOA meetings, she guided discussions with subtle precision. If someone raised a concern, she acknowledged it with a nod, reframed it, and gently steered the conversation in a different direction. By the end, people often agreed with decisions they hadn't even realized were being made. It was impressive. And unsettling. Because once you started paying attention, the pattern became clear. Linda didn't just enforce rules, she decided how and when they mattered. Complaints filed by certain residents were addressed immediately. Others seemed to disappear into paperwork. Approval for renovations, changes, or exceptions often depended less on the request and more on who was asking. And Linda always knew who everyone was. Their habits. Their properties. Their weaknesses. Including mine. The first time she approached me, it felt harmless enough. A casual conversation near the shoreline, her heels sinking slightly into the softer ground as she walked toward the dock. "Alex," she said, her tone light, almost friendly. "I was just admiring your waterfront. It's quite expansive." I nodded, keeping things polite. "It's been in my family a long time." "Of course," she replied, her smile widening just a fraction. "And you've done such a wonderful job preserving it." It sounded like a compliment. But something in the way she said preserving lingered, like it wasn't entirely approval. Over the following weeks, those interactions became more frequent. She'd stop by under the guise of curiosity. Ask about the stability of the dock. The maintenance of the shoreline. The positioning of my benches, even the angle they faced the water. Every question seemed reasonable on its own. But together, they formed a pattern. She wasn't just observing. She was assessing. Measuring boundaries. Testing limits. Gathering information. There was always that same careful balance in her tone, never confrontational, never overtly critical. Just enough interest to seem engaged, just enough detail to suggest authority. And always, that smile. Sweet on the surface. Sharp underneath. Most of the neighborhood admired her. They saw dedication, leadership, someone committed to maintaining the community's standards. But I saw something else. Obsession. Because Linda didn't just care about the neighborhood. She wanted control over it. And my shoreline, untouched, unmodified, outside her influence, was the one piece that didn't fit into her perfectly curated vision. Which meant, sooner or later, she was going to do something about it. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. Too quietly. It was early morning when I noticed them, bright orange stakes driven into the ground along the edge of my shoreline. They stood out sharply against the dark soil and green reeds, forming an uneven line that cut across the land like a scar. At first, I didn't panic. I told myself it had to be something routine. Maybe a survey. Maybe maintenance. The HOA occasionally scheduled minor work around shared areas, and although my property wasn't part of that, mistakes happened. But something about it didn't sit right. The placement was too precise. Too deliberate. I walked closer, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, eyes tracing the line of stakes as they stretched further than they should have, past any reasonable boundary, deep into land I knew. Without question, belonged to me. That's when I saw the tire tracks. Fresh. Deep grooves pressed into the soil, leading from the road straight toward the water. Heavy machinery had already been through here. And not just once. A cold feeling settled in my chest. This wasn't preparation. This was the beginning. I followed the tracks until I found a man standing near a stack of lumber, hard hat, clipboard, focused on something he was checking off. "Hey," I called out, keeping my voice calm as I approached. "What's going on here?" He barely looked up at first. Just flipped a page, then glanced in my direction like I was an interruption. "HOA project," he said simply. I frowned. "On my property." That got his attention, just enough for a brief shrug. "Everything's approved," he replied, tapping his clipboard like that settled it. Approved. The word echoed in my head, heavy and wrong. Approved by who? I asked, stepping closer now, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. He didn't answer right away. Just gave me a look, the kind that said he wasn't interested in getting involved. "Talk to the HOA," he muttered before turning back to his notes. That was it. No explanation. No verification. No concern. Just dismissal. I stood there for a moment, staring at the stakes, the lumber, the tracks carved into land I had walked my entire life. The morning air felt different now, thicker, charged with something I couldn't quite name yet. Confusion started to give way to something sharper. Suspicion. Because this didn't feel like a mistake anymore. It felt organized. Planned. I took a few steps back, scanning the shoreline again, this time with a different perspective. The stakes weren't random, they marked something. A layout. A blueprint already decided. And somehow, I hadn't been part of that decision at all. That's when the unease settled deeper. Because if something had been approved on my property without my knowledge, then this wasn't just an oversight. It meant someone had signed off on it. Someone with authority. And there was only one person in this neighborhood who would push something like this through without hesitation. Linda Hawthorne. I didn't have proof yet. But I could feel it. This wasn't the start of a small problem. This was the first move in something much bigger. By the next morning, there was no more doubt. Whatever had started with those orange stakes had turned into something far worse. I woke up to noise. Not the kind I was used to, the soft rustle of wind through trees or the distant call of birds across the lake. This was sharp. Mechanical. Violent. The rhythmic pounding of hammers. The grinding snarl of chainsaws. The metallic clatter of scaffolding being assembled piece by piece. For a moment, lying there, I thought I was dreaming. But then it kept going. Louder. Relentless. I stepped outside, and the sight hit me like a punch to the chest. Construction crews were already spread across my shoreline. Trucks lined the edge of the property. Lumber was stacked in tall, organized piles. Workers moved with purpose, measuring, cutting, assembling, as if they had every right to be there. As if this had been planned for weeks. And in a way, it had. I walked closer, my pulse quickening, trying to process what I was seeing. Wooden frames were already rising from the ground, rectangular outlines that unmistakably formed the skeletons of small cabins. Not one. Not two. 12. 12 structures carving into the land my family had protected for generations. Each one positioned carefully along the water's edge. Each one claiming a piece of the shoreline. And just beyond them, I could already see where smaller docks would extend into the lake, thin wooden arms reaching into water that had once been mine alone. The smell of fresh-cut timber filled the air, mixing with the damp scent of earth and lake water. Sawdust clung to everything, drifting through the sunlight like a haze. It felt suffocating. I spotted the same foreman from the day before and moved toward him, this time faster, the restraint in my voice beginning to crack. "You need to stop this," I said firmly. "Right now. This is private property." He didn't even pause his stride. "Talk to the HOA," he replied, like it was a rehearsed line. "I already tried that," I snapped, stepping in front of him now. "You're building on land you don't have permission to use." He sighed, clearly annoyed, and finally met my eyes. "Look," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "we've got the paperwork. We've got approval. I'm just doing my job. And I'm telling you it's wrong," I shot back. For a second, there was tension, thick, hanging between us. But then he just shook his head and stepped around me, calling out instructions to his crew like the conversation had never happened. And just like that, I was invisible. I stood there, surrounded by noise, watching strangers dismantle the piece I had spent my entire life protecting. Every hammer strike felt personal. Every board nailed into place felt like a line being drawn, one I hadn't agreed to, one I couldn't seem to stop. This wasn't just construction anymore. It was an invasion. Deliberate. Confident. Unapologetic. And as I looked out across the shoreline, my shoreline, being transformed into something unrecognizable, one realization settled heavily in my chest: this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a takeover. And whoever was behind it had no intention of asking permission. That night, the noise finally stopped. No hammers. No engines. No voices shouting over the chaos. Just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence I had always known. It felt wrong. I sat at the edge of my dock, knees pulled in, staring out across the lake as the last light of day faded into a dim, cold twilight. The water was still, reflecting the sky in muted shades of orange and grey. Normally, this was my favorite time, when everything slowed down, when the world felt distant and small. But now, even the lake felt different. Contaminated. Across the shoreline, the half-built cabins stood like shadows, dark, unfinished shapes cutting into the horizon where nothing had ever stood before. Their frames blocked the view, interrupted the open space that had once stretched endlessly across the water. It felt like something sacred had been broken. The smell of fresh timber still lingered in the air, mixing with the damp scent of the lake. Sawdust clung to the ground, to the dock, even to my clothes. Every breath carried a reminder of what had been taken. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, staring down at the water. And memories started coming back. Not gently. All at once. My grandfather's voice, low and steady, echoing across the lake as he called me in at sunset. My father's laugh when I caught my first fish, the way he clapped me on the shoulder like I'd just accomplished something huge. Long summer nights where the only light came from fireflies dancing just above the grass. This place wasn't just where those moments happened. It was the reason they existed. And now someone had stepped in and tried to rewrite it. I clenched my hands, fingers tightening until my knuckles went white. At first, it was anger. Sharp. Immediate. Almost overwhelming. The kind that makes you want to storm into someone's office, slam your fist on a table, demand answers right then and there. But beneath that anger, something else was growing. Something quieter. More focused. Because deep down, I knew something important. If I reacted too fast, if I let anger take control, I'd lose. People like Linda didn't win through force. They won through control. Through timing. Through making sure everything looked legitimate on the surface, even when it wasn't. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to calm down, even as the weight of everything pressed against my chest. This wasn't just about defending my property anymore. It was about protecting something much bigger. A legacy. A history that didn't belong to anyone else. And that's when the shift happened. Right there, sitting on that dock, staring out at the damage, something inside me hardened, not into rage, but into resolve. I wasn't going to react. I wasn't going to panic. And I definitely wasn't going to let them get away with it. If they thought they could take my land quietly, then I would take it back the same way. Quietly. Strategically. Completely. I lifted my head, eyes settling on the silhouette of those unfinished cabins one more time. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about how I was going to win. I didn't go back inside right away. For a while, I just sat there on the dock, staring at those half-built cabins, letting the silence settle into something sharper, something clearer. The anger had cooled, replaced by a kind of focused calm I hadn't felt since this all began. And then it hit me. Not a memory exactly, more like a realization. There was something I had. Something I hadn't thought about in years. I stood up slowly, heart beginning to pick up pace again, not from panic this time, but from possibility, and walked back toward the house. Each step felt deliberate, like I was moving toward something I should have remembered sooner. Inside, the air felt still, untouched by the chaos outside. I went straight to my office. At the back of the room, tucked beneath the desk, was a small, locked wooden box. It wasn't anything special to look at, worn edges, slightly faded finish, but I knew exactly what was inside. I hadn't opened it in 3 years. Not since the day I decided it was better left alone. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I reached down, unlocked it, and lifted the lid. Inside were documents, carefully stacked, meticulously organized. Old property deeds, survey maps, easement records, legal correspondence. Papers that had been passed down along with the land itself, preserved not just as records, but as protection. I sat down and started going through them, one by one. At first, it felt like retracing steps, confirming what I already knew. The original deed. The boundaries of the property. The historical surveys outlining every inch of land, every curve of the shoreline. But then I found it. The easement document. Thicker than the others, marked with notes in the margins, my father's handwriting. I leaned in, reading more carefully now. Line by line. Clause by clause. And that's when everything shifted. The language was clear. Unmistakable. The shoreline wasn't just part of my property, it was protected by an exclusive lakeside easement that granted full control over access, use, and any development within that boundary. No structure could be built. No modification could be made. Not without my explicit consent. I sat back, the weight of those words settling in. Because that meant one thing. Everything they had built. Every cabin. Every dock. Every single nail driven into that land was illegal. Not questionable. Not debatable. Illegal. A slow breath escaped me as the realization fully took hold. The confusion, the doubt, the frustration, it all started to fall away, replaced by something much stronger. Clarity. For days, I had been reacting to what was happening, trying to understand how it could even be possible. But now I knew. It wasn't possible. They hadn't found a loophole. They hadn't outmaneuvered me. They had simply ignored the law. And in doing that, they had made a mistake. A serious one. I looked back down at the document, running my fingers lightly across the page, feeling the texture of the paper like it carried something more than just ink. This wasn't just proof. This was leverage. The kind of leverage that didn't just stop construction, it could dismantle everything they had done. Carefully, I gathered the documents, stacking them back into order, but this time, I didn't close the box. Because I wasn't putting them away again. I stood up, holding the easement papers in my hand, and for the first time since this started, I felt in control. The shoreline outside hadn't changed yet. The cabins were still there. But the balance of power? That had just shifted completely. And Linda Hawthorne had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I didn't waste time. I was up before sunrise, the easement document spread across my kitchen table, every page reviewed twice, every clause burned into my memory. The calm I felt the night before hadn't faded, it had sharpened into something precise. But I needed confirmation. Not instinct. Not assumption. Proof. I picked up my phone and called the county planning office the moment they opened. Each ring felt longer than it should have. My fingers tapped lightly against the table, my eyes drifting toward the window where I could just make out the silhouette of those cabins along the shoreline. Finally, someone answered. County planning, how can I help you? My voice stayed steady. Hi, I need to verify zoning and development permissions for a lakeside property. Specifically regarding easement rights and unauthorized construction. There was a brief pause as the clerk pulled up records. I could hear typing on the other end, fast, efficient, routine for them, but for me, everything hinged on what came next. All right, they said. Can you give me the parcel number? I read it off, watching my reflection faintly in the window as I did. More typing. Another pause. Then, okay, I see it here, the clerk continued. This property includes a protected lakeside easement, for exclusive use and control assigned to the deed holder. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. That means, I said carefully, no development can take place without my consent, correct? Correct, they replied without hesitation. Any construction within that easement would require direct authorization from the property owner. HOA approval alone wouldn't be sufficient. There it was. Clear. Direct. Undeniable. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the confirmation settle in. What if construction has already started? I asked. Another pause, this one shorter. In that case, the clerk said, their tone shifting slightly, you have several options. You can file for an immediate stop work order or injunction. The county can enforce a halt on all construction activity while the matter is reviewed. I leaned forward slightly, fully focused now. And the structure's already built. If they're found to be in violation, and based on what I'm seeing, they likely are, you can pursue penalties, fines, and potentially require full removal of any unauthorized development. Full removal. The words echoed louder than anything else. Not just stopping them. Undoing everything. I thanked the clerk, ended the call, and set the phone down slowly. For a moment, I just stood there. The room felt different. Lighter. Because for the first time since this started, there was no uncertainty left. No grey area. No room for manipulation. The law was clear. And it was on my side. But as reassuring as that was, I knew something else just as important. Having the truth wasn't enough. People like Linda didn't lose because someone told them they were wrong. They lost when they had no way to deny it. No way to twist it. No way to escape it. Which meant I couldn't rush this. I couldn't walk into an HOA meeting waving documents and expect everything to fall into place. That's not how power worked here. This had to be airtight. Documented. Unquestionable. I glanced back out toward the lake, toward the cabins still standing there like they belonged. They didn't. And soon, everyone would know it. But not yet. Not until I was ready. Because now, this wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about making sure they couldn't fight back. And for that, I needed more than the truth. I needed strategy. Knowing I was right wasn't enough. I had the documents. I had confirmation from the county. Legally, the situation was clear. But legally clear and strategically one are two very different things. And if there was one thing I understood about people like Linda, it was this: they didn't panic when challenged. They adapted. They delayed. They redirected. They buried issues in meetings, paperwork, and further review. They created just enough confusion to keep control. If I walked in too early, too emotional, too unprepared, she'd turn it around. And I'd lose momentum. So instead of confronting her immediately, I made a different move. I called an attorney. Not just any attorney, a property lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Someone who understood exactly how these situations played out behind the scenes. Her name was Rachel Turner. Direct. Efficient. No wasted words. After reviewing the documents I sent over, she didn't hesitate. "Alex," she said, her tone calm but firm, "you're in a strong position. Very strong. But don't confront them yet." I leaned back in my chair, processing that. "They're already building," I replied. "If I wait, they'll just keep going." "Yes," she said. "And that works in your favor." That caught my attention. "Right now, they think they're operating with authority," she continued. "Which means they'll keep documenting their own violations. Every day construction continues, they're digging themselves deeper." I looked down at the photos I had already taken, the stakes, the lumber, the first cabin frames. "And if I stop them now?" I asked. "You interrupt the pattern," she said. "You give them time to adjust their story, fix paperwork, or shift blame. You don't want that." That made sense. More than I wanted it to. "So what do I do?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Document everything," she said. "Every structure, every worker, every stage of construction. Dates, times, photos, videos. If neighbors have seen it, get statements. Build a timeline they can't dispute. Her voice sharpened slightly. And most importantly, stay quiet. I exhaled slowly, staring out toward the lake again. Stay quiet. That was the hardest part. Because every instinct I had was telling me to act, to stop them, confront them, demand answers. But this wasn't about instinct anymore. This was about precision. Once we move, Rachel continued, we move with everything. Legal notice, injunction, enforcement. No gaps. No questions. They won't have room to maneuver. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. All right, I said finally. I'll start documenting. After the call ended, I didn't waste time. I grabbed my camera first, not my phone. Something higher quality. Something that captured detail clearly, professionally. Then I stepped outside. The noise of construction hit me again, but this time, it didn't overwhelm me. It focused me. I began taking photos, wide shots of the shoreline, close-ups of the cabins, timestamps on every frame. I recorded video of workers building, trucks arriving, materials being unloaded. Every sound. Every movement. Every violation. I wrote everything down. Dates. Times. Descriptions. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was building a case. And with each piece of evidence I collected, something inside me shifted even further. The frustration faded. The anger quieted. Replaced by something colder. More controlled. Because now, I wasn't reacting to what they were doing. I was preparing for what I was about to do next. And when the time came, there wouldn't be any doubt. There wouldn't be any debate. Only consequences. The next few days settled into a routine. Not a normal one, but a deliberate one. Every morning, I woke up before the crews arrived. Coffee in hand, camera ready, notebook open. I'd take position where I could see the shoreline clearly without drawing attention, watching as the first trucks rolled in and the day's work began. At first, it felt strange standing there silently while they continued building on my land. Every instinct still pushed me to step in, to stop it. But I didn't. Because now, every minute they worked was another mistake they were making. And I was capturing all of it. The cabin started taking real shape. What had once been wooden frames became walls, roofs, defined structures. Stone fire pits appeared between them, carefully placed like this had all been part of some polished development plan from the start. Small wooden decks extended outward, and the beginnings of private docks pushed further into the lake. Each addition made it worse. And better. Worse, because it was harder to watch. Better, because it strengthened my case. I documented everything. Wide shots showing how far the construction extended into my shoreline. Close-ups of workers installing beams, laying stone, securing dock posts directly into the water. License plates on trucks. Company logos on equipment. Faces, timestamps, sequences. Nothing was left out. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Rachel had been clear about that. So I started talking to neighbors. Carefully. Quietly. I didn't make accusations. I didn't explain everything. I just asked simple questions. Have you noticed the construction down by the lake? Most of them had. Some were confused. Others assumed it had been approved. A few admitted they had wondered why I hadn't said anything. That part worked in my favor. Because it showed something important, no one had been told the truth. I asked if they'd be willing to confirm what they'd seen. Just observations. Dates. Activity. Some hesitated. But others agreed. And slowly, I began collecting statements, written, recorded, each one adding another layer of credibility to what was happening. The timeline started to form. Day by day. Action by action. It became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, construction didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated. Which told me something else. Linda wasn't second-guessing anything. She believed she was right. Or at least, untouchable. And that confidence? That was going to cost her. By the end of the week, I had everything laid out. Photos organized. Videos labeled. Notes structured into a clear sequence. Witness statements documented and signed. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a narrative. A complete, undeniable record of what had been done, when it had been done, and how it had crossed every legal boundary that protected my land. I sat at my desk that night, looking over everything one more time. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was catching up. I felt ahead. Because while they had been building cabins, I had been building a case. And unlike theirs, mine was solid. All that was left now was to bring it into the light. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived colder than usual. Not in temperature, but in feeling. Everything about it felt sharp. Focused. Final. I parked a few houses away from the community hall, sitting in my car for a moment longer than necessary, the folder of evidence resting on the passenger seat beside me. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was control. I picked it up, stepped out, and walked toward the building. Inside, the room was already filling. Low murmurs drifted through the air as neighbors took their seats, some curious, others unaware of what was about to unfold. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, polished table, neatly arranged papers, the usual setting of quiet authority. And at the center of it all, Linda Hawthorne. She looked exactly as she always did, perfectly composed, posture straight, expression calm. Her eyes lifted the moment I entered, locking onto mine with that familiar, practiced smile. "Alex," she said smoothly, as if this were just another routine meeting. "Didn't expect to see you today." I didn't return the smile. "I think you did," I replied, walking forward and placing the folder on the table in front of her. The room quieted. She glanced down at it, then back up at me, her expression barely shifting. "And what is this?" "Everything," I said. "Every document, every photo, every violation tied to the construction on my shoreline." There was a subtle change then, a flicker in her eyes. But she recovered quickly. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," she said lightly, reaching for the folder. "All projects were properly approved through, they weren't," I cut in, calm but firm. I opened the folder myself, turning it toward her, and the rest of the board. Inside were the easement documents, clearly marked. The county confirmation. Photographs laid out in sequence. Dates. Times. Progression. Proof. I didn't rush. I walked them through it. Step by step. "This is my property line," I said, pointing to the survey. "This is the easement, exclusive control over the shoreline. No construction allowed without my consent." I flipped to the next page. "These are the stakes placed without notice." Another page. Day 1 of construction. Another. Day 3. Day 5. Cabins fully framed. Docks installed. Murmur started spreading through the room. Confusion. Realization. Discomfort. I let it build. Then I stepped back slightly and looked directly at the board. "I contacted the county," I said. "They've confirmed it. The HOA has no authority to approve development on this land." Silence. Heavy. Absolute. One of the board members shifted in their seat, flipping through the documents more carefully now. Another leaned toward Linda, whispering something under their breath. And for the first time, Linda didn't look in control. Her hand hovered over the papers, her polished composure beginning to crack at the edges. "This," she started, her voice tighter now, "this will need to be reviewed. It already has been, I replied. Right on cue, the board's legal advisor, who had been quietly observing, cleared his throat. Based on the documentation presented, he said, adjusting his glasses. The construction appears to be unauthorized and in violation of both municipal code and property easement restrictions. The room shifted instantly. What had been uncertainty turned into clarity. Linda's grip tightened on the edge of the table. That's not, she began, but stopped herself. Because there was nowhere left to go. No angle left to argue. The evidence was too clean. Too complete. Fines were discussed. Immediate suspension of construction was ordered. Formal notices were drafted on the spot. And as the weight of it all settled into the room, every eye slowly turned toward Linda. The woman who had always controlled the narrative was now part of it. Exposed. And as I stood there, watching it unfold, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with quiet certainty, I realized something. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the moment everything shifted. Because power, once questioned, doesn't come back the same. And Linda Hawthorne had just lost hers. By the end of the week, everything had changed. Construction was halted. Official notices were issued. Fines were imposed. And every structure that had been built on my shoreline was marked for removal. What had started as a quiet takeover ended in a very public unraveling. But the moment that stayed with me wasn't inside a meeting room. It was back at the lake. Standing at the edge of the shoreline, I held a simple ribbon across the boundary of my easement. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet marker of what had always been mine. With a small pair of scissors, I cut it cleanly. The sound was soft. But it carried. Neighbors who had gathered nearby began to clap, not loudly, not wildly, but with understanding. Respect. Because this was never just about land. It was about limits. About standing firm when something is taken without asking. Linda never fully recovered her influence after that. The confidence, the control, it was gone. And as I stood there, looking out across the water once more, hearing the gentle lap of waves return, I realized something simple. Justice doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, it just needs to be undeniable.